We've explored the origins of life, how life came to be on this planet, but how has life evolved over time? We know that the first life forms appeared on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago, and the first life forms were cyanobacteria. So how did life go from being single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms that think and function? So essentially, how did we end up with modern humans? How did we end up with all of the diversity of life that we see on this planet? That's what we're going to talk about in this lecture, Evidence for Evolution. So before we can talk about evidence of evolution, evidence supporting evolution, we need to first define exactly what evolution is. Evolution is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. So we've talked about the Cambrian explosion, and what we said about the Cambrian explosion is a lot of the organisms that evolved during that time have become the ancient ancestors for all of life that are on the planet today. So all of life today, according to evolution, has descended from ancient organisms. So evolution, is it fact or is it theory? Well, first let's define fact. Fact is something that has undergone repeated tests over a period of time. It's more certain than a theory. A theory, on the other hand, is something that has not yet been proven. So a collection of carefully reasoned and tested hypotheses have been supported by evolution. In science, we have very few facts, but we have a lot of theories. When those theories become widely accepted in the scientific community, they often become known as theory. Evolution is still technically a theory because we can't build a time machine and go back in time and look at the different organisms evolving through time, but we have so much evidence that is supporting this idea of evolution that in the scientific community it really has become thought of as a fact. Some examples of fact or theory. For instance, gravity exists. We know that's a fact. Isaac Newton was the scientist who helped us to understand that gravity exists and the effect that gravity has on all objects on Earth. And you should understand Newton's 3 laws at this point. So there is no doubt that gravity does exist. What goes up has to come down, just like the bottle rockets. However, physics don't completely understand how gravity exists. So it's a fact that gravity exists, but the ways in which gravity works is still theory. So another fact. Life on Earth has changed over time. Well, we know this is true because there are no longer any dinosaurs. And when there were dinosaurs, there weren't modern humans. So the life that is living on planet Earth has changed over time. However, explaining how life changes over time continues to be one of the greatest challenges in biology. And it's one of the ideas that we are exploring in this unit, Origins. So what is some evidence for evolution? Similarities in early development, fetal development specifically. So embryos of many different animals tend to have a similar appearance when they are in the fetal stage. So similarities of vertebrate embryos show that there are similar genes at work because it is our genes that are creating our physical features. What our genes are doing is telling our bodies which amino acids to bring together to create certain proteins, and those proteins create our physical features. And if we look at the embryos of vertebrates, we can see very similar features. So what we see here are 4 different organisms and the embryonic stages broken down into each of the trimesters. First trimester, second trimester, third trimester. And as you can see, the fish, the chicken, the pig, and the human all look pretty similar during that first trimester. It's during the second trimester that certain genes start to turn on and certain genes start to turn off. And as genes are turned on and off, it determines proteins that are made and proteins that aren't made. And that's when we begin to see differentiation into the individual species. So embryonic development is evidence supporting evolution. The fact that these 4 organisms look similar during the first trimester of fetal development tells us that we all share a common ancestor. Makes sense since we're all vertebrates. We all have a backbone. So it makes logical sense in science that we all descended from a common ancestor. All right, Similarities in body structure shouldn't come as any surprise, since there are similarities in embryos, and embryos are when our body structures begin to develop. So we call these homologous structures. So homologous structures are parts of different organisms that develop from the same ancestral body part. What in the world does that mean? Well, an example would be the limbs of various vertebrates all have a similar structure. So, for instance, if you look at the forearm of humans, at the arm of a human, we have this big bone here, and then we have two radial bones up front. Well, that design in our arm is also found in the flipper of a whale, the leg of a dog, and the wing of a bat. Because the design is the same, it's called homologous structures. That prefix homo meaning the same. So it's the same structure. It serves a different function. In humans, we use our arms to pick things up and to push things away. Whales are using their flippers to swim. Dogs are using their legs to run. Bats are using their wings to fly. So these structures have different functions, but the structure is actually the same. The bone structure is the same, and therefore it's considered a homologous structure. And you can see them in this photograph lined up side by side, and you can see how similar all of the bones are. So there's one big bone attached to two bones, which is attached to a bunch of bones in the wrist, which is attached to 4 or 5 what we call fingers, digits. Vestigial organs is more evidence of evolution. They're organisms that are so reduced in size or functions that they really don't serve a purpose anymore. But what it indicates is that at one time they did serve a purpose. Some classic examples of this, the tailbone and the appendix in humans. So humans still have a tailbone, but we don't have any tails anymore. Why do we have a tailbone if we don't have tails? Well, probably because our ancient ancestor did have a tail. The appendix is an organ that humans have, and it can be removed if necessary, and we can function just fine without it, because it's a vestigial organ. It's thought that the appendix at one time acted as a second stomach. Before humans started eating cooked food, we needed a second stomach to help break down the raw food. Cooking food actually helps to break down the proteins, which makes it easier to digest. So if food isn't cooked, then the proteins are fully intact and they have to be broken down by the stomach. This is why cows have 4 stomachs. Also, there are tiny bones on the underside of pythons and boa constrictors that we think are leftover legs. So this is the tailbone in humans. And if you look very closely at this python, you can see a little nub coming out of the center of the picture. That's a tiny bone, and it's believed to be a leftover leg. Obviously, snakes don't use legs anymore, but it is thought that they descended from an ancient ancestor shared with reptiles. More evidence are similarities in chemical compounds. What does that mean? Well, we all have genetic information. Everything alive has to have genetic information. If you recall, that's one of the characteristics of life. So all organisms, from bacteria to humans, use DNA and or RNA to carry information from one generation to the next. So most organisms have both DNA and RNA. DNA is the molecule that actually contains our genes. It's like the recipe that's telling our cells how to make a body. What the RNA does is it translates the DNA into a language that the cells can understand. Well, when we look at the DNA of eukaryotic organisms, eukaryotes are organisms that have multiple cells. Prokaryotic are organisms that have only one cell. So we are eukaryotic organisms because we are multicellular. So the DNA of all eukaryotic organisms has the same structure and replicates in the same way, which is fascinating. So this is DNA, and when we look at DNA, you can see a structure here. There's a phosphate group, there's a 5-carbon base to it, and then also nucleotide. So this is DNA, This is RNA. And what you'll notice is they're very, very similar. They look very similar, except that the RNA has uracil. The DNA has thiamine. That's the major difference between RNA and DNA. All eukaryotic organisms rely upon RNA to translate DNA into a language that the cell can understand. Again, this is giving evidence that we must have all descended from a common ancestor. The fossil record is also evidence for evolution. So species that have gone extinct, such as the dinosaurs, and new species that have developed, such as Homo sapiens, modern humans. This is evidence that life has changed on Earth, that evolution has happened. So not only is this telling us that there were once species living here that were no longer here, and that modern humans have not been around as long as the Earth has been, what it also can tell us is how a species itself changes over time. Modern humans, as you know, did not always look and function the way that we do today. We did not always cook our food. We did not always have language. We were not always 6 feet tall. When we started out, we were actually quite smaller because it made more evolutionary sense. The smaller an organism is, the less energy it needs, the less food it needs to eat. But over time, we have evolved certain physical features that modern humans didn't have in the beginning, such as height. We also used to be covered in a lot more hair. And the fossil record, as I just said, is showing us that species change over time. Alright, so some observed evolution. So examples. Drug resistance in bacterial strains. Now, bacteria reproduce very quickly, every 20 minutes. So it's actually quite easy to witness bacterial evolution over many generations because they reproduce so quickly. It's important to remember evolution doesn't happen in one lifetime.